minutes through the interview, and then we open it up for questions. Now, if anybody wants to stay later, and if you're able to do so, we can do sort of like an after party, if we want to do that. But there's no obligation to do so. Also, Eric does record these, and we do post them on YouTube, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if that's all right with you, what I'd like us to do is get started. Are we good with that?
I'm good with that.
That is wonderful. So everybody, I'd like you to meet Monique Huston. Believe it or not, Monique and I actually met for the first time at Anshe Emmett at Steak and Shots. We had heard about each other. We had many friends in common, but we had actually never met until Steak and Shots, I think 2015 or 16, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Monique is somebody, I did post her bio, okay, but she's somebody who has had many roles in the industry. We're going to be talking about that too. But before we get started, I do want to know, Monique, what are you drinking tonight and why?
There's a lot of bottles sitting right here. I've been doing, hopefully none of you were on Instagram at 8 o'clock this morning, but I was, because I was with my team from the Boutique Whiskey Company in London. They were doing their daily afternoon tea, and I was their guest. So I've got some Boutique bottles. Actually, I'm drinking a Signatory 7-year-old Mortlock, just like young. It's young.
Can you show it to us? Can you show us the bottle?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's bright. It's vibrant. It's inexpensive enough for a single cask. I love Mortlock. Mortlock is fabulous. It's owned by Diageo. Yep, good one. Okay. And it's a top dresser for the Johnnie Walker blends. So if you're going to go through and make Johnnie Walker Red, Johnnie Walker Black, you get 99% of the way there, and then typically they pull drops, a few liters of Mortlock, Linkwood, and Longmore. Those are the top dressers for the Diageo family. So to be able to kind of rescue a single cask for them is great. And like the 7-year-old, it's in a bourbon barrel. It's probably $50. I mean, so it's inexpensive enough that it's an everyday drinker, but it's young, bright. It's a great first dram to have today on this beautiful Monday.
I actually think that I have that Mortlock 2008 on my shelf right now. As a matter of fact, I always have to have Mortlock on the shelf because one of my best friends, Brian Nagorski, loves Mortlock. So I always have to have a bottle of it on my shelves. And he always has a bottle of Four Roses for my wife because she loves Four Roses. So
awesome.
Yeah, it all works out rather well.
Teamwork in the whiskey world.
Right. So what I'm drinking tonight, you're going to recognize.
Oh yeah, okay. You've gone the opposite direction. You went Ardbeg.
No. This is the Blair Athol.
Oh, now I can see it more close. Oh, it's got that teddy bear creature on it.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So this is yours. Okay. This is single malt Scotch whiskey from the Boutique Whiskey Company, Blair Athol Distillery, 18 years, 50.6%. So, can you please tell me what I'm drinking? Because I got to tell you, this is freaking delicious. I love it. Yeah,
it's really gorgeous. Blair Athol is another Diageo-owned distillery. So Diageo, largest spirits company in the world. They also own Guinness. They own Johnnie Walker. They own 28 single malt Scotch distilleries in Scotland of about 120. So a good portion of the business, a good portion of the gallonage. I think total output, Diageo is now only second to William Grant & Sons that owns Glenfiddich and Balvenie. And they own, a lot of them are these teeny tiny distilleries that you'll pretty much never hear about because everything's going into the blends. So you don't see Blair Athol really bottled out on the general market. A lot of people do visit it. It's really close to Edgeworth as you're kind of going from Edinburgh up into the Highlands. It's a pretty easy distillery to get to, and it's pretty easy to tour. They've got like commercial tours running every day, but it's a very classic, I'd say kind of Speyside style, like a lot of orchard fruit, typically in honey. They're almost always aged in used bourbon barrels. So you'll get some of like the vanilla, coconut, just kind of those classic notes. With Boutique Whiskey Company, Boutique doesn't own warehouses. So they're different than independent bottlers like Signatory. In that Signatory can buy things that are very young and nowhere near being ready to bottle because they know that they can sit on them for 5 years or 10 years or 30 years.
However long until it's ready.
until it's perfect. Or they could sell it. They can do whatever they want with it. Boutique is very different. They're actually owned by Anheuser-Busch. They're owned by AB InBev. And they were the first spirits company, the group Master of Malt that owns Boutique. They were the first spirits company that they purchased. under this thing called ZX Ventures. And if you guys can imagine, all of you know, AB InBev owns Budweiser. You think Budweiser knows what to do, you know, with a few single barrels of like distilleries no one's ever heard of? I mean, they have no idea. So they got a big budget. When they were purchased by AB InBev, they were injected with about $10 million of capital, which isn't very much, doesn't actually stretch very far. And so for them, it really behooved them to buy barrels of whiskey that were ready to be bottled immediately. So not warehoused at all. So they're very, they're most of the time a single barrel or 2 or 3 barrels, very small batches, sometimes bottled at cask strength, sometimes with a little bit of water. And again, it's mostly because they're not going to warehouse it. So they want it to taste, you know, exactly how you want it to drink. I'll admit, sometimes even I bottle things, single casks, a little hot. Because I'd rather err on the side of having too much alcohol than having too much water. I mean, you can't go back and take that back. So, I mean, if you're ever tasting something that's too strong, add more water to it.
Right.
Botiki, their master blender, the person who picks the barrels, Sam Simmons, was the master. He was the blender for Balvenie and Glenfiddich for a long time. He's Dr. Whiskey on most social media. A lot of people know him. He was with Balvenie for a very long time. Sam picks all their barrels now. So Sam actually then will taste, and then he'll decide if he wants to proof it down a little bit. So sometimes they're cask strength, but they're almost always right around 50% alcohol. Okay. That's what he thinks is right.
Okay, so I need you to clarify something for me here. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned a few different companies, and I'm not sure I understand the relationships between those companies and your relationship with those companies. So for instance, I know you work for Winebow. You have mentioned the company, that Botiki Whiskey Company, and I have seen your name associated with them several times. And you've also mentioned Signatory, and I know you've done stuff with Signatory. Can you talk a little bit about those relationships and your roles?
Yeah, I mean, it's just following the 3-tier system that we have in the United States, you know, post-prohibition, to keep alcohol safely in people's hands and keep kind of security and safety measures along the way. So in some cases, we act as the importer for these spirits, and in some cases, we act as the distributor on the state level for these spirits. So for Botiki Whiskey Company, we bring them into the United States, and then we basically sell them to ourselves in the 20 states where we have distribution. But with like Signatory, we are their distributor here in Illinois, but I am not their distributor in California. So I wouldn't be able to sell as an individual. I can't go sell Signatory in California. I guess I could, but my company wouldn't make any money from it.
Got it. Okay, all right, that makes it, because I'd like the other day, for instance, you had this wonderful Binny's Whiskey Wednesday. Okay, that was an amazing talk where you were going through all those Signatory bottles. Is this going to be something that happens on a regular basis? Because I learned so much in that talk. It was wonderful to hear you and Brett Pontoni.
I'm so glad.
Going on.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Binny's has been, I don't really know how to word it, a little bit reticent to jump on the virtual spirits kind of thing that's happening right now. I think a bit because Michael Binstein is very aware that they are really profiting. They're about 40%, most retail is about 40% higher than they were at this time last year. And there's a lot of people suffering. There's a lot of people that don't have jobs. There are a lot of businesses that are suffering. Most restaurants are not in business. And so I think Michael has been a little delayed and doesn't want to seem as though he is taking advantage. So if you guys subscribe to Binny's emails, you haven't seen as many emails in the past couple months.
I have not.
Really, he just doesn't want to seem like he's, you know, like, oh, we're making all this money. And anyway, the way of the world moving forward is going to be virtual tastings. That we don't know when the next time is that a group this size can even meet at Binny's. We have no idea. And so with that, last week, Pat and Brett asked me to come in and we were all 3 in the store, but you guys know how big that back room is. We were all spread out in the back room.
Right.
So we were totally socially distanced. But that was the first time they'd done any kind of virtual tasting. So I think they're going to do one a week moving forward. And I might be on some of them, but they'll pick other, you know, Binny's single cast. So we did the 4 newest, I have them all actually right here. We did the 4 newest barrels that we had just bottled for Binny's in January. And then I think we're also going to do agave spirits on Mondays. I think we're going to pepper in some other things other nights. But, you know, if we're going to drink this stuff and spend good money on it, part of what Binny's offers is that education, you know, is that level of education and tasting. So I think it's great that they want to do that.
So I don't know if everybody on here knows this, but from what I understand, didn't Brett Pontoni organize most of your wedding in Scotland, from what I understand?
I mean, I think I organized most of it, but I did. If for those of you that know Brett, you guys know Brett. I mean, I know he's at the temple. He does tastings and stuff there too. Brett's been like my big brother for 20 years. I mean, he's one of my best friends in the whole world. And there was no. I was going to ask him to perform the ceremony, but I knew he would cry. He is a crier. And so we asked a really good friend of mine who's Jewish, who's from Long Island. No, he's from Staten Island. And Jordan actually wrote the ceremony for us and performed it. But I knew Brett was going to be bossy and involved no matter what. So I made him the master of ceremonies. And he was wonderful at it because our wedding was in Scotland. It lasted 4 days. It involved distillery tours and going to St. Andrews and all kinds of things. And he was really bossy. He lined everybody up and he made sure that everything was on time. So
that's wonderful. Because I've seen some pictures online of you and Brett in front of a bunch of samples. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I know that both you and Brett have been involved in judging, okay, at competitions and things like that. Can you tell us, what are you really looking for in a special whiskey? Like, really, because you taste so many things that are so good. How do you know when it's special, and what is it that tells you that?
It's interesting, Gil. So Drew Faulkner, that you were talking to earlier, Drew used to head up all the judging for the American Distilling Institute. So that's how Drew and I have gotten really close over the past 10 years. Drew knows a lot about this. But, the interesting thing with things like ADI or San Francisco Wine and Spirits, or we just did a Midwestern bourbon competition, is you're not really separating good from bad. That's the hope. Mm-hmm. What you're really trying to do is separate good, better, wonderful. You're trying to, you want to encourage people when they're doing things well. And so the thing with a competition specifically like ADI that you probably see us do a lot, which is the most prestigious one in the United States, specifically for domestic spirits, is you get a lot of new distillers. And so like you can see Paul's got that Oppidan shirt on. That's a great distillery here in Wheeling, Illinois. Mm-hmm. So if Jeff is only a 1-year-old distiller making bourbon and he is buying grain from farmers in Illinois and he's milling it himself and he's doing, literally he's a one-man operation in a strip mall. We don't want to just we don't want to judge his bourbon against Four Roses single barrel. Like, he hasn't had the time. He hasn't had the experience. He doesn't have the warehouses and the choice of barrels. So things are typically kind of grouped into, okay, these are under 1-year-old, these are 1 to 2 years old, these are, whatever. And then, obviously the type of whiskey. Mm-hmm. And then we try to we're very stingy with our medals. If something in most competitions is getting like a gold medal, that's, you got to be stingy with that stuff. When you start getting into like silver, bronze, maybe not so much. But we try to be encouraging. We try to give feedback. And on most of the panels, a lot of times you'll have someone like me who's in distribution who kind of, can field distribution questions and look at packaging and pricing. You also want a retailer there so they can give an opinion on how this is going to sell in retail. Mm-hmm. We like to have a distiller on the panel with us. So someone who does this professionally every day. They help us learn if we do find an off flavor. Was that something that happened in fermentation? Was this a water issue? Were the bottles not cleaned properly? Were they not sealed properly? Were these not rested? And you can taste all those things. So it's taken years to develop that palate, but you have to have kind of a smattering of experts at a table. And we do find things that are completely flawed. You find things where you cannot come up with one word of constructive criticism.
Wow.
Ooh, Drew's got funny. Something to say.
Well, it's funny because I'm a few of the people on here have actually competed with me in barbecue competitions.
Oh,
and
yeah, that's right.
And it's funny, every once in a while, we compete, we think it's really good, and it comes back with a big 0. We don't know. Sometimes we win. It's really, being on the other side. Yeah. It's interesting to hear what the judging is.
You need the constructive criticism. You need feedback, and you need to say, so we'll say, we can tell the difference when something ages in a 5-gallon barrel versus a traditional 53-gallon barrel. You can taste the difference. And so you might just say to somebody, you really need to put this in a full-size barrel, or this needs to age for longer, or you need
Can you
to
how can you tell that difference? What is the difference there?
Small barrels tend to give you oaky flavors, tannic flavors, but not the flavor that a properly toasted, charred, aged barrel would give you, like vanilla, coconut, the things, you know, so they tend to just give you wood flavor. And so those are typically pretty easy.
Yes,
I was going to say, I think Drew, you look like you wanted to add something.
Well, yeah, no, I had kind of the funny how I met Monique's story to interject, because we were talking about the ADI judging, and you know I started running that about 2009. And when was the first judging you came to, Monique? Was it about 2011?
It was 2011. Yep.
2011. And you know, when I started running it, Bill Owens kind of said to me, he said, "Find that woman, get that woman." And it's like, what woman? That woman, she lives in the Midwest somewhere. I think it's Ohio. She runs a bar. She has more whiskeys than anyone else. You have to get her. You have to ask her to be a judge. She's great. She's fantastic. And I couldn't get Omaha out of Bill because he didn't remember, and I couldn't get much out of him. And then I'm inviting Brett to the judging. It's like, oh, dear great Brett Pontani, could you please come be a judge at ADI? And it's like, well, I'll be coming back from Seattle at that time, and I'll have Monique with me. Monique's welcome, isn't she? And I'm like, Monique? Is this that woman who has a bar in the Midwest somewhere, maybe named the Dundee? And so that's how Monique came into the ADI judging. Was
Oh, that's a great story.
It's an amazing group of people.
Yes, you were with Brett. That's wonderful. So I've heard stories about this bar in Omaha. You know, Duffy says that I have to ask you about it. So how did that happen?
A show of hands, has anyone sitting here been to the Dell in Omaha? Anybody been to the bar? Thank you, Evan, my friend. It's a pretty amazing place. I mean, and Marty was a very early supporter. He wasn't the earliest, but he was very early. You know, if any of you have ever been to Omaha, you know, it's a thriving metropolis. And
Evan's wife is from Omaha. That's his wife.
There you go. Yeah, okay. Dead giveaway.
Yeah.
Dead giveaway. I know now my husband's been a bunch of times, and I'm sure never would have gone. But it's you know, when I started there, the bar had existed since Prohibition. It was the second liquor license granted post-Prohibition. So the bar had been there since 1934, and the third owner took over in 1989, and I came on board at the end of 1998. I was getting my master's. I was back from school. I was getting my MBA in Omaha, and I started waiting tables. I'd always waited tables, you know, my whole life. And that year at Christmas, I tried single malt for the first time at our Christmas party, at the work Christmas party. And I knew they had a lot of single malts. I mean, in 1998, we had about 300 single malt scotches. I mean, so it was a significant collection.
Yeah, that
was everything you could get your hands on, you know, at that point in time. And so I had my first single malt, I mean, God bless it, was a 40-year-old Strathyla bottled by Gordon MacPhail. I mean, so, you know, talk about going from zero, you know, to 100. And I had studied wine pretty thoroughly. So I really had this great a good comprehension of wine, you know, and tannin and structure. And actually, because it was aged in a sherry barrel, there was so much wine in it after 40 years. It was a total light bulb moment. It really was. And that was on a Sunday night. And by the next Saturday, I was helping give our Scotch tastings. That week I read went back and read a Michael Jackson book and a Charlie McLean book. And by the next spring, 6 months later, I was in Scotland with our group. And by the time I left there, you know, 11 plus years later, we were the largest single malt Scotch publicly available collection in the United States, if not the world. You know, that was pretty hard to qualify. 2009, 10, 11, it wasn't like everybody was on the internet and, you know, so we had 1,400 open expressions of single malt Scotch behind the bar. And if you go now, we've sold it. We sold it to our top, our seafood purveyor, who's a great restaurateur and just a really, really solid background in restaurants. We sold Fish and Chips. It's a great restaurant. there's probably still 600 scotches behind the bar. And I mean,
That's
I go
incredible.
in and I see stuff that I brought back illegally from Scotland. And I'm going to finish that bottle. And
We're recording. We're recording. Just,
just don't. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one last question before I open it up to questions here. Keeper of the Quake.
Thanks for pronouncing it right.
You know what? I think it was Joshua Hatton who corrected me once when I said it incorrectly. All right. Keeper of the Quake. So can you tell us a little bit about it? No, you're going to show it to us. Oh, this is wonderful.
Because I'm at home, so
You're
I actually
at home.
have
This is great. This is amazing.
That's my little.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
So tell us, what does this mean, and what does this mean to you?
My story with this is really unique because Keeper of the Quake, if anybody goes and you Google it, you're just going to find a static page. You can't find anything about it. You can't ask to join. You have to be nominated, seconded, and thirded by people who are already keepers, and you have to have a minimum of 10 years of service to the single malt Scotch industry. So it, in some cases it's enthusiasts, sometimes it's importers, sometimes it's people who own bars, you never really know. And at some point in time, I'm sure, I just loved the idea of that. And I thought, man, if I got that in my life, in my lifetime, that would be fascinating. Because there are there's master distillers who've been in the business for 50 years who maybe don't have it because they work for a tiny company and it's expensive. I mean, when people put you through the whole process, it's really expensive. So the team that owns Edgewood and Signatory, Andrew Symington, that's also where we had my the dinner the night before my wedding was at the Edgewood Distillery. So I mean, those two are like my uncles. I mean, they're amazing. I've picked Signatory barrels for the US market for 16 years now. So I have a really, really great relationship with them. I'm kind of like their unpaid brand ambassador because they don't have an ambassador here in the US. So I got invited to come over. I knew that it was the same weekend as the dinner. And so I put that on my calendar. That's fine. There's going to be a ton of people in Scotland, my friends. And then Andrew and Brett was coming obviously too. And they said, bring a formal, you're going to come to the dinner as a guest. And I thought that's the coolest thing ever, just to get to sit at a table with these other people being inducted. I was really, really excited about it. Little did I know, Andrew, who's a master of the Quake, Andrew nominated me, a couple other people, seconded and thirded me. And so I'm in a winter formal, it's cold, and we go to Athol Castle and you get piped in, and all the other inductees see the list of inductees. So they all knew, and Brett or someone reached out to all of them and said, don't say anything to her. So even when I was there, it was like, I'm saying hi to everybody. And it was, I'm trying to think, there were some big time people that got inducted. Oh, Mickey Heads, who's the master distiller for Ardbeg now, who had been at Jura. Mickey got inducted in the same class. Mickey's been in the industry for 30 years. Mickey deserves that, kind of overwhelming. So we go in and Andrew said, I'm a master of the Quake. He's been in it since the beginning, since the 80s. And he has extra privileges in the castle. He said, do you want to go upstairs and I'll show you some of the rooms and stuff. I was like, oh yeah, whatever. So we get up to the top of the stairs and they hand me a piece of paper, and I thought it was our seating chart or a seating arrangement. So I didn't read it. I just kind of put my hand down, and then I look back up, and Andrew and Brett and Des, everybody has tears in their eyes, and they're just looking at me, waiting for me to realize, and I just burst into tears. I mean, it was just... So my picture where you're holding your Quake and you get this big platinum pin and all these other things, you can tell I was crying. My face is just bright red. But I mean, to get inducted with Mickey Heads, the master distiller of Ardbeg, we went in alphabetical order. So Mickey went right before me. I was in shock. I mean, it was easily one of the best nights of my life. It was really amazing.
Of course. Yeah. That's, and with that, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to ask Eric now to open it up for questions. Eric, if you can take it away, moderate this however you would like. And we're going to open up for questions for about 15 minutes or so, and we'll see where this takes us.
Sure. You can go ahead, Paul.
Fantastic. I always have questions for Monique, so this is great. So we were talking about 30-gallon barrels, smaller barrels. This is probably one of my favorite 30-gallon barrel whiskeys that I've had. Of course, it's one of Jeff's, but it's one of his malted rye. So I know generally we much prefer, 53-gallon barrels, etc. But if you had to pick something that you've drank from a smaller barrel, such as a 30-gallon, what would you pick?
30 is a different 30 versus 53. Like you can find some really good stuff. I more have issues when you're down in like 5 and 10 gallon barrels, but I like a lot of what Jeff has done. He doesn't just make traditional rye. He makes malted rye.
Yep.
And so because he is malting the grain, it's a conscious decision of how to treat the grain and the cooperage. I really like Journeyman up in Michigan. And Bill uses a lot of small cooperage. And I think Bill's whiskeys, again, he specifically picks the mash bills and the type of grain to complement the flavors that are going to come from the cooperage. So, it's different when someone is using small cooperage because that's all that's available, or that's all that they have, or all that they can afford. And the plan is to graduate up. I think it's very different than when it's a conscious decision to get flavor X. And so I'm going to put distillate Y into it. So even like when Paul up at Few got started, I mean, I represented Paul from the very beginning, and a lot of Paul's stuff was in 15s and 30s when he started. But as his whiskeys have evolved, the mash bill has evolved, and the cooperage has evolved. And so I think it's just kind of tasting and listening and evolving as those researchers do. It's a great question though, but there's some good ones out there.
Somebody else?
I think Ariel has a question.
Go ahead.
Oh boy.
Hi.
Hi.
This is admittedly half-baked because it occurred to me while you were talking, and I did a bit of legal research while you were talking on the other screen. Is there any well, so as far as having a tasting, right? So we're all having these virtual tastings, but we're not necessarily, I mean, some of us have more extensive bars than others, but we're not necessarily going to be able to pour for ourselves what is going to be discussed. Assuming that the regulations can be worked out, is there anyone talking about maybe doing a package tasting product that could be, 10 small bottles, you pick it up at the store, you go home, and then you have an event the next night or 2 nights later where you taste and talk about it? Is that something?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and don't get me in legal trouble, but there's a group right now that's based here in Illinois called Cocktails for Hope, and it's led by Julia.
Well, I was looking at their petition. I know that they haven't gotten the regs passed yet.
So if Chicago or if Illinois decided to pass legislation that said that we could do cocktails to go, then you could package up whiskey in small you could seal it in like little plastic containers. There are also ways amongst yourselves, if you guys chose to go buy some things and then distribute it, I'm happy to lead.
Yeah, actually, Monique, I'm going to interject here that something that dovetails off of both what you said and Ariel just said is that in 2 weeks on the 18th, we're actually interviewing Bill Welter from Journeyman. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to the local binnies over the next few days and see what Journeymans they have in stock, and then send out an email to everybody here. Maybe I'll be able to arrange like a small discount or something like that. But I'm going to try to do something like that so that for Bill, we would have one of his bottles.
Michigan's
if we can do that.
Liquor Commission could be
Eric, I think that Lynn had her hand up before.
Yeah. Lynn?
Hi there.
Hi.
Some years ago, Ralph and I happened upon you, Monique, and Brett, and a bunch of other people around a picnic table with what looked like a bunch of test tubes, and you were, quote, sampling from barrels, deciding what you were going to bottle, and if you weren't going to bottle it, you would pass on the samples. How does that process actually work? Who gets these, who takes the samples? Who gets them first? How does that process work?
It's a good question, Lynn. It's, Brett and Binny's sit pretty high in the pecking order, as you might imagine. And so, you know, yeah, so if it's like Buffalo Trace, or, you know, it's a really big bourbon company, they have a set allocation for how many barrels of something the Binny's chain is going to get versus like Bevmo in California, or Total Wine, or like a small shop in New York like Astor Wines or Park Avenue. But he's kind of like up in that top 10 kind of pecking order. Just a few weeks ago, we actually did a podcast. I haven't listened to it. It's probably not great to listen to people pick barrels, but we picked some James E. Pepper rye barrels. So we picked some 11-year-old rye barrels. And I was in Kentucky at the distillery, and they sent me home with 7 samples. We sat down, we tasted the 7. 3 of them just immediately, it was Brett, Pat, Joe, my team, Laura and Sarah. So 8 of us sat down, blind, did our notes. We were only going to pick 1, but there were we just couldn't not take these 3. They actually will be in Binny's maybe Friday. And so then that means that we still have 4 samples left. So, you know, nobody really wants the seconds. There's nothing wrong with them. You know, it's fine. So in some cases, if there's another local retailer, we work a lot with like Garfield's or Antioch Wine and Spirits up in Antioch. If those people, you know, sometimes we make sure that they get things first, or maybe we do it a separate round from when Binny's gets to see things. So maybe it's 6 months later, we'll go approach 3 or 4 independent retail stores so that everybody has the same opportunity. And then at the end of it, honestly, Lynn, things get vatted together at my house. I mean, I've got, I think they're in the kitchen. I've got unmarked, you know, I kind of have infinity bottles that are just unmarked bottles. Because I've been doing this 20 plus years. I mean, over that long, you know, I used to work with High West, and then High West was purchased by Constellation. I must have had 100 barrel samples, bourbon, rye, everything from High West, you know, just little bits of them. So there just got to be a point where we were cleaning, and I just took all the ryes and I put them in a bottle, all the bourbons and I put them in a bottle.
Oh my God.
Yeah. They'll get consumed. I mean, they're not going to go to waste.
That's wonderful.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of samples in Brett's office too. You ever go upstairs or into the back room at Binny's, there's a lot of samples. And
I remember
hang on, you know, when the barrels are selected, we leave the original samples with the retailer, because then we can taste it against the final product and make sure that it was. We do that, and we keep those samples as a record. So the ones that are chosen, we keep those.
Yeah. Once, Monique, I was at Binny's with a few friends from out of town. It was about 10, 12 years ago. And fortunately, Brett was there that day. And we were chatting, introduced him to my friends. And then he said, "Oh, hold on, I got something for you. I'll be right back." And he goes to his office, and he comes back with a bottle about half the size of your boutique thing. And it was actually from Buffalo Trace, and it was something that it was like 140 proof, you know, right out of the barrel. And he said, "Here, have it." Okay. And we were drinking it later, and it was delicious, but it was such a unique, you know, opportunity to just drink something like that never shows up retail.
Well, it's interesting too, because when I help them blend their Buffalo Trace batches, when they do the Binny's batches, those typically we start with about 100 samples and we end up with about 50 that end up being the batch. And it isn't like you pick the 50 best and they taste good together. That's actually the opposite of what happens. You pick out ones that are the ones that stand out as the best. You actually kind of set those off to the side, and you start picking things that are really sweet or really vanilla-y, really spicy, really woody, and you get all the components and you put together something that the sum of its parts is greater than the individuals. And Gil, what you ended up with was probably one of those single barrels that we would have tasted and gone, "This is just too good."
Right. Yeah, no, we really enjoyed that. So,
good.
Great. Next question.
So actually piggybacking on that, so when you do blend together the samples, how long do you typically let that sit before you bottle it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Eric. And they do actually have to rest. It's not like a maturation thing. It's that you have differing levels of alcohol and water, and they need to actually like kind of come together. I mean, they chemically need to come together. And when you pour more than one together, and especially if you dilute things, it actually, the whole process gives off heat. And so if you've ever gotten a bottle of spirits that like in the neck of it will show little almost like drops of water or something. Very often it's because that spirit, even if it's vodka or gin, but very often with whiskey, it hasn't been rested. So it actually needs to be rested in something. It could even be stainless steel. It needs to be rested in something that allows all those molecules to actually like bond and join together and kind of settle out. And then if you're going to dilute it, you've got to rest it further. So for a lot of whiskey, you know, I was on talking to Ian Miller, who's the master blender for Glenfiddich and Balvenie last week. And when you drink like the Glenfiddich 15, that's in a marrying tun that's open its whole life. Like there's never like a lid on that thing. Or if you drink the Balvenie tons, those are kind of open. I mean, and they're just like blending things in the whole time. So you have like many, many months of marriage. For a lot of blended whiskey, it might be 30 days. Like that's pretty typical. For clear spirits, it's probably more like 2 or 3 days, but everything's got to rest before you bottle it.
That's fascinating. Next question.
Michael Nolan.
Monique, first off, thank you very much for doing this tonight.
Nice to see you.
Enjoy it, appreciate it. I guess I've got 2 questions. One, easy. You mentioned a few minutes ago you have 3 casks coming into Binny's next week. Those. And then the second question is, what's your kind of go-to or your favorite distillery? What do you enjoy if you go home? You know, is there a particular one, or are you kind of like all over the place?
It really depends. So we got these 4 signatory casks into Binny's last week. So that was a Thrusk, a Daluin, a Strathmill, and this really gorgeous, heavily sherry. This is an Edradour 10.
Can you turn that? We can't see the front of it.
It's just the color is like one of the really notable things on this.
And those are the 4 whiskeys you went through last week in the podcast for Binny's, right?
Yep.
That was Wednesday, right? That was the Whiskey Wednesday.
And this, I mean, this Edradour is, I mean, the sherry in it is really beautiful. The 3 that we're bottling that are going to come in, they landed today in my warehouse. So they'll go to Binny's this week or next week. They are 11-year-old single casks of rye that all would have been distilled in Indiana. So it would have been all LDI. So it'd be, I mean, it's just old rye like people are sourcing. The difference is that Amir has owned James E. Pepper now for over 10 years. So he bought them as new make. So it's very different from every brand that's sourcing, trying to compete for these 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old barrels. Amir's been sitting on them for 10 years. So we're really drinking just absolutely beautiful distillate. I think they're going to be just over $100. For 11-year-old rye isn't crazy, but they're really, really gorgeous. You know, and Michael, my kind of, I don't know, my go-to lately has been, I love the regular J. Rieger. Their Kansas City whiskey has sherry blended into it. And it's like, it's $35. Like it's really inexpensive. But if it happens to be a really warm day like Saturday was, you can throw some soda or like even ginger ale or something in it. But it's like a cooler night like tonight, it's really, really good neat. And it's, you know, especially I'm on a lot of virtual tastings or Zoom calls with my family. I'm not just having one. You know, it's not like you have one at the end of the day. You kind of, you know, you end up, so I was on with my family for 2.5 hours last night. So it's like, I got to have something in front of me. I will tell you guys this, the 20 of you in confidence, we were on I have a standing Tuesday night with my group from the Dell. We've done this Tuesdays at 4 for 20 years. We get together Tuesdays at 4. And now we're doing it virtually. So we had the national brand ambassador from Ardbeg and Glenmorangie. So we had Cam and Dan, and then we had, yeah, Paul, you would have loved it. And then we had Brendan McCarran, the master, well, he's under Dr. Bill, but he does all the Glenmorangie stuff. And I hadn't had the new Glenmorangie 15-year-old in American Oak. It is absolutely gorgeous. Really? My husband, we've been making fun of me. I had 8 ounces of it in 4 hours. And I can tell you, I wasn't hungover, which is amazing. That's the most that I've had to drink in probably a year. But I looked at the bottle the next day and was like, did I do that? Like, did I drink all that? But that's $100 bottle. Like, I can't be drinking $100 bottles every night, you know? So I try, if I'm going to drink more, I got to put something cheap in front of me.
Oh, that's wonderful. So, you know, on that note, when we're talking about drinking too much, Eric, if you can do me a favor and unmute everybody for a moment. You can just unmute everybody.
Yep.
And if everybody can raise a glass and say cheers to Monique.
Cheers.
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 Cheers. Oh, nice.
Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
you know,
you.
you know, Monique, I'm sure you know. If you wanted to stay on for a little bit longer, that's fine too. If you don't, that's fine. You know, because I know you could talk about whiskey for hours and hours. But this is, you know, officially the end of the program, so to speak. You know, we can turn it into an after party if anybody wanted to stay for a little bit. But I just want to say thank you very much. This has been wonderful. And we started doing this right after Whiskey Week was canceled. Okay, because we needed to have some socialization around something we love. And so thank you for helping us with this. So again, cheers. Thank you very much.
You'll see more of me. I'll stick around for another 15 minutes till dinner starts coming out.
Great.
Awesome.
And to follow up with everybody on the Whiskey Week. Whiskey Week is not gone. It's not canceled. It will come back. We just really have to figure out what the city is going to do and social distancing and all that kind of stuff. I mean, because we know it's going to be a bigger group than, you know,
normal.
You know, we know it's going to be a bigger group than 50 people, you know, or whatever it is.
Do you really think that Binny's is going to be able to ever hold a world of whiskeys again? I mean, it just doesn't seem possible.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know,
Of course they
Michael,
will.
you know, it's
Yeah.
weird.
They will.
We'll get past this thing. Come on now.
I think so too. And you know, too, and I don't mean to be, I'm not flip about any of this. I take this really seriously and I'm in a mask and all that stuff. But it's like, that being said, I've been in and out of Binny's at least once a week. You know, my husband runs restaurants. He's in and out of restaurants running these takeout programs and stuff. So we're doing our best to stay really safe. But I mean, I don't get the flu most years either. So I don't feel overly cautious or overly, I'm going to be the one that wants to start hugging everybody as soon as I see them. You know,
Me
as
too,
soon as
absolutely.
Yep,
absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, if I get sick, hopefully we're all, you know, healthy enough, vibrant, vital enough that we don't get sick, you know, but I think at the end of this, yeah, I don't know. I'm with you, Naomi. Hopefully the dogs don't have it.
Naomi, glad you could join us.
Way to go,
I know
Naomi.
you were a little bit late, but Naomi, thank you for being here.
Oh my God, thank you. I had a Shiva at 7 and I actually handed off hosting to somebody else. I said, hey, it's going to be awkward me sticking around at this Shiva with people I don't know. So can I just hand off hosting to you? And it was really sad.
Tell them the real reason.
I met Brian Nagorski's mom at the Shiva.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
He just left. All right.
Oh, Miffy, she's wonderful. We love Brian Nagorski's mom. Miffy's wonderful.
I'm a fan of the Nagorskis. Monique, I was trying to get Bino Gopal to join us, but he's still
I saw that. He's so
California.
Funny.
I know him from UCLA. So.
Monique, my wife wants to know if you know Sharon Broadkey.
I do know Sharon Broadkey. Yeah,
we figured, yeah. Right.
Sharon Broadkey of Broadkeys.
Of the Broadkeys, yeah.
Of the
yeah. How about
Broadkey
Steve
Broadkeys?
Broadkey? Steve Broadkey was my roommate in college, so.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Sharon's really nice. We used to, they were not big drinkers, if I remember right, but we used to see them in for dinner and stuff.
Sharon is, if I remember correctly.
A bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was really funny. The question came up this morning at 8 a.m. on our event. Someone asked if I had ever given a tasting that was particularly awkward. And I hadn't thought about it in a long time, but once I had to do an event where a gentleman came who was Mormon and who had never had alcohol in his life.
That's awkward.
Wow. Yeah, that's awkward.
And he brought his wife and 5 daughters and wanted to taste alcohol.
Is this the beginning of a joke?
No. Wait, a Mormon came to a whiskey tasting?
I thought you were going to say his wife and his 5 wives. I wasn't sure.
No,
right.
5 daughters. It was
5
interesting
daughters.
they wanted to be really focused. I said, you know what? I'm going to really focus. So less on the tasting, but let's talk about the history. Let's talk about the heritage. Let's talk about whiskey. And he got like a little tipsy. I didn't ever see him again after that. But it was really funny. His wife said, you can go drink once, but we're going to learn about it. You're going to pay money and you're going to go to, but I was really anxious.
Yeah,
it was tough.
So he just was a Mormon who just really, it was kind of like, I'm so lobster curious that I imagine one day I'm going to like try to, like, I'm going to try lobster, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so I think he just said to his wife, like, I'm just so curious about it. And so she said, okay, let's go do this thing once, but we're going to do it in a safe space with education involved and everything else. I mean, maybe he went off the deep end after that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Look, good for them for trying it, you know?
Yeah.
Nice.
I'm drinking a mistake right now. Oh, you can't see it. I walked into Binny's and saw a bottle of Bunnahabhain through some kind of independent bottling for 130. Wait, it was like a 24-year-old Bunnahabhain, and I was like, oh, I must have that. That can't be bad. Yes.
It's so. Yeah.
If there's anything that comes bad out of Bunnahabhain, but this is an Adelphi. I bought 2 bottles of it.
Hey, Monique, why? Is there an idea for Boutique to release full-size bottles ever?
No, that was me asking for them to be that size. The thing is, and you guys have seen this, they're pretty expensive. I mean, even for 375s, you know, and so imagine paying double that, you know, it makes it a little bit less approachable. And so early on, we didn't have a lot of choice. Well, they're 500 mLs in the UK. So it was either 375s or 750s. And we kind of just decided to dip a toe in with the 375s. But what we found is that most of the time people find one they really like, they drink that bottle and maybe they'll buy another one to hold back. And so, you know, we do kind of see people buying a couple of them. So I don't see it going that direction just because they're expensive. But
here's my regret of not buying 1 million bottles of this Bunnahabhain right out of the barrel.
Oh, those are beautiful. We've got another round of signatory barrels that'll be here in June. And Naomi, one of them is the heavily peated Bunnahabhain. One of them is a Stoisha.
I don't like
it?
I don't like peat.
The Stoisha is wonderful.
I like Bunnahabhain because I don't like peat, but I love Isla, but I don't like peat. So Bunnahabhain is pretty much the ideal whiskey for me because it has all the body of an Isla, but it doesn't have all that peat.
Yeah.
So this is one that.
So avoid the Stoisha. Ariel can drink
it.
Anything
somebody gave me a very kind gift because he heard Bunnahabhain but missed the I can't stand peat part and bought me a bottle of Bunnahabhain heavily peated, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell I'm going to do with that. I'm not drinking that.
Naomi, I have a suggestion. I'll give you my address.
Maybe we can help.
We can help.
I'll take it.
Yeah, seriously, there are many people who can help you out. So Monique,
you can break out
one thing
bottles.
One distillery I love in particular is Springbank. Okay, and I know that there have been changes with Campbelltown. Okay, and that they had, you know, you have to have that they were going to lose their status as a region, you know, and then can you talk a little bit about Springbank? I just love it so much. And actually, Springbank was introduced to me by a Benny staff person back in like 1999. Okay, and I just love it so much.
Springbank is one of the longest term independently Scottish owned distilleries. I mean, it's really, really special. And Hedley Wright that owns it doesn't have an heir, and he's in his 80s. And so when he passes, ownership will pass to the citizens of Campbelltown. So he has ensured that it will not fall into the hands of Diageo or Pernod or any of the big companies, which I think is pretty beautiful, kind of like a Green Bay Packer model of distillery ownership. But at one point in time, there was only the Glen Scotia distillery and the Springbank distillery operating in Campbelltown. And so the Scotch Whisky Association said, you know, there's only 2 distilleries there, you're no longer a region. And you got to remember back, if you go back 100 years, Campbelltown, the peninsula down in the southwest of Scotland, was like the most densely populated area of distilleries because of the proximity to where barley was growing in the lowlands, the sea, you know, good water, all kinds of things. So that being said, there were like at one point in time over 30 distilleries just dotting that peninsula. So now you've got just 2 at the very end of the peninsula. So the Scotch Whisky Association said, yeah, you've only got these 2. So we're going to discontinue calling it a region. And they were really smart to do this, but Hedley Wright and his team looked at the other regions, and there were only 3 distilleries owned by Diageo mostly, but 3 distilleries in the lowlands. And so they said, well, if you're going to call the lowlands, you know, a region and it has 3, basically what you're saying is if we had 1 more distillery, we could keep our region status. And so they decided to open the Glengyle distillery.
Right.
The name Glengyle is actually the output name is trademarked by Diageo, and they won't give it up. So the whiskey that comes out of the Glengyle distillery is called Kilkerran.
Kilkerran, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's just a tiny little distillery down there.
Now
So it's
I'm
owned by
showing you right now.
Springbank.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
there it
actually
is.
called Glengyle. If you go there, it is the Glengyle distillery, and it's teeny tiny. It's like a 300,000 liter a year, which is like what a like Glenfiddich does in a day. Like it's a tiny distillery. And they're only operating.
Whiskey.
They make great whiskey. They make
It's
beautiful
really,
whiskey.
it's solid, and I'm picky. Like my
Really? I didn't know.
Yeah. Right.
so, like it's a solidly nice whiskey and a good deal.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
Well, and
that's
you're
great.
really, and you know, too, Springbank and Glengyle, they floor malt all of their own barley. They do wonderful things for the community there. And like I said, I mean, independent Scottish owned. It's, if I really have to pick like a desert island, like I'm just going to drink one distillery for the rest of my life, it would probably be Springbank. And like for people who
Me
haven't
too.
been to
Absolutely.
Scotland, like Springbank to me is the pilgrimage, is like is Mecca. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
Yep.
you know,
Yeah,
200
Springbank
plus
would be
years
mine
old.
too. I love Springbank.
Springbank is a close second to Bunhabing for me. It
Yeah.
is a close second.
That's great.
for sure.
So I just want to remind everybody, 2 weeks from tonight, we have Bill Welter from Journeyman. And then a week after that, on the 26th, we're going to have a lot of fun with Joshua Hatton and Jason Johnstone Yellen.
Oh yeah, that would be fun.
Okay. Now they are. I mean, we know them well, and you know, be forewarned, that might not be a 45-minute talk.
It will not be a
If you have the
45.
two of them
Bring a
on,
full bottle. Bring a full bottle for that
Yeah,
one.
no, it's great. And Monique, I got to tell you something. This stuff is freaking amazing. You know, I don't know if you saw, but I posted a very short video of me tasting it when I opened it a few days ago.
I
And,
can see it. I gotta
Oh,
look.
you didn't? Oh, I tagged you on it. So it's. I know you're busy, but I'll try to make sure that I tag you on it again. Really, it just made me smile. And tonight's been wonderful. And again, everybody, just say thank you to Monique.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique.
Always so nice to
Awesome.
see
Very
you.
nice.
Thank you to Eric Leader once again for hosting all of us on Zoom. It's been wonderful. Eric
My
Leader.
pleasure.
Good job, Eric.
And
All
I'll
right.
see you guys in a couple weeks. I'll be on with Bill. I'll probably be on with Josh and Jason. I love those guys too. So
Excellent.
we'll see you
That's
guys.
wonderful.
Okay, cheers, guys. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.
Be
Cheers.
well.
Good night, everybody.
Y'all.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Good night.
Thanks,
Night.
Gil. Nice job, Gil. Great questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely.
Yeah, really
Bill,
good.
thanks a lot. Always
See you guys.
fun.
Bye.
Always a good time, people.
Bye,
Thank
Jane.
you.
Bye, Jane.